Ovek Thrain kept an unfinished report open on his desk terminal for 311 days. He never sent it. He was not sure who he would send it to anymore, since the person it was addressed to had stopped speaking in full sentences 2 months ago, and now mostly stared at the ceiling of the med bay with his gill slits fluttering in a slow, private rhythm that the healers would not explain to Ovek in any language he found comforting. The report was titled, in Ovek's careful engineering hand, Succession Readiness, Negative. He kept meaning to delete that last word. He kept not deleting it, the way you keep not touching a bruise you already know will hurt. Mirren Deep sat 400 meters under the black water of Thessa's southern trench. A cluster of pressure domes strung together like beads on a wire, holding back an ocean that wanted very badly to come in. It had stood for 130 years. In all that time it had never once needed a full structural repair beyond routine maintenance, because Mirren Deep did not run on redundancy or backup systems the way some colonies did. It ran on a person. One master engineer per generation. Trained from childhood. Holding the entire pressure architecture of the dome network in a single mind, because the Ithun believed, and had believed correctly for over a century, that one trained mind moving with total certainty was safer under crushing water than a committee arguing about probabilities while the hull groaned around them. It was not arrogance. It was a lesson learned early and paid for in lives, back when the colony's founders had tried a rotating engineering council and lost an entire outer ring to indecision during a storm surge nobody had been willing to take sole responsibility for stopping in time. After that, they chose one voice and trained it for decades and never doubted the choice again. The current master engineer was named Halvarin Kess. He had held the dome together for 41 years. He had trained exactly one apprentice in that time, because the training took most of a working lifetime, and there was only ever room in it for one student at once. That apprentice was Ovek. Halvarin was not going to finish the job. Ovek had 11 years of training behind him, and by his own honest count on his worst nights, perhaps 60% of what a master engineer needed to know before he could be trusted with the dome alone. The rest was supposed to come from another 9 years at Halvarin's side, learning the 1,000 small judgments that never made it into any manual because they had never needed to. Halvarin did not have 9 years left. He did not have 9 months. The healers used careful, rounded words like decline and prepare yourselves, and Ovek had learned to translate those words privately into something closer to 9 weeks, on a good stretch. He was thinking about this, as he thought about it most mornings while he walked the seam checks alone, when the arrivals hatch at the top of the access shaft chimed twice, and the guild liaison walked in trailing a human behind her like something she hadn't quite decided how she felt about bringing. Ovek, she said, this is Ren Castillo. Continuity Core. He's your new structural consultant, on loan for the season. Behind Ovek, in the narrow observation gallery above the arrivals hatch, 3 junior technicians had stopped their work entirely to stare down at the new arrival, the way anyone on Mirren Deep stopped to stare at anything from outside the trench. Humans did not often come this deep. Most of what the colony knew about them came from trade broadcasts and the occasional passing survey vessel, second-hand stories that made humans sound either impossibly reckless or impossibly lucky, depending on who was telling the story and how many drinks they'd had while telling it. Ovek looked at the human for a long moment before he answered. Ren was of ordinary human height, which put the crown of his head well below Ovek's shoulder, dressed in a plain grey work suit with more pockets than Ovek could be bothered to count, carrying a scuffed tablet tucked under one arm the way some creatures carry a limb they were simply born with. He had the loose, unbothered look of someone who had slept sitting upright on a transport seat for 2 days and considered that a perfectly acceptable way to arrive somewhere new. Consultant for what? Ovek said. It came out flatter than he intended, and he did not particularly try to soften it afterward. For whatever you need, I guess, Ren said, and put out a hand in a gesture Ovek did not recognize and therefore did not take. Ren adjusted without visible offense, dipping his head instead, A small easy motion that suggested this was not the first unfamiliar greeting he'd navigated in his life. I read your dome's maintenance history on the way in. Impressive design, honestly. One person load-bearing knowledge, though. That's a bold way to run a colony this deep for 130 years. It has worked, Ovek said, for 130 years. Sure, Ren said, in a tone that was polite, and did not quite agree with him. Right up until the one person runs out. Ovek felt something tighten behind his ribs at that, a small, precise cruelty the human clearly hadn't intended, landing exactly on the wound Ovek had been quietly nursing alone for 311 days. He said nothing. He decided, in the space of 90 seconds, that he did not like this human, filed the decision away as settled, and led him toward the lower access ring without further conversation, already composing in his head the polite, useless report he would eventually write about why a human clerk with a tablet had no business anywhere near a dome that could kill everyone inside it in under 4 minutes if handled wrong by the wrong hands. Behind them, one of the junior technicians in the observation gallery leaned over to another and asked, quietly, what a continuity core consultant actually did all day. Neither of them had an answer. By the end of the season, everyone on Mirren Deep would. The lower access ring ran the full circumference of Dome 3, a curved corridor of reinforced glass looking out into water so dark it swallowed every light they carried within a few meters, leaving only the faint, drifting glow of things that lived out there and had never once been properly catalogued. Ovek walked it twice a day, checking seam pressure by feel more than by instrument, the way Halvarin had taught him before his hands had steadied enough to trust the readouts alone. Ren walked it once beside him, and spent nearly the entire walk talking quietly into his tablet. What are you doing? Ovek finally asked, when the low, continuous murmuring became impossible to keep ignoring. Logging, Ren said, not looking up. Seam pressure readings, your visual checks, what you're looking for and why you're looking for it there specifically. I'd love audio of you actually explaining it out loud sometime, if you're willing. Back there you said something about the 7th seam sounding wrong. What does wrong sound like? It sounds, Ovek said, after a pause, like something Halvarin can hear, and I am still learning to hear. Right? That's exactly the kind of thing I want written down. Why? Ren looked up from the tablet then, seeming faintly surprised by the bluntness of the question, and took a moment before answering, as if deciding the question deserved something more than a reflexive response. Because right now the only place that knowledge exists is inside one man's head, and one man's head, no matter how good, is not a backup system. No offense meant to your whole training tradition. It's clearly worked. But it only ever had to survive one person retiring peacefully at the end of a long life, with years to hand things off clean and careful. That's not what's happening here, is it? Ovek said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would not have been a lie, and Ren, to his credit, did not push further. He simply let the silence sit, and kept walking. They found the crack 2 hours later, on the outer flange of seam 9, a hairline fracture no wider than a strand of hair, weeping the faintest possible thread of moisture where none should exist at all. It was small. By every measure Ovek had been formally trained on, it was not urgent. Halvarin, in his good years, would have looked at it, made a small dry sound of acknowledgement, and scheduled a routine resurfacing pass for some time in the coming month, unbothered. Ren crouched in front of it for a long time, tracing the crack's path in the air above the glass with one gloved finger, careful never to actually touch it, then lifted his tablet, and took 11 photographs from 11 separate angles that Ovek would not have thought to bother with. This bothers you, Ovek said. It was not phrased as a question. A little, Ren admitted, straightening up slowly. Small cracks that show up alone don't worry me much on their own. Small cracks that show up alone on a dome that just had a seismic advisory 2 days ago worry me a bit more than a little. Ovek had seen the advisory. Everyone on Mirren Deep had seen it, posted routinely on every public terminal the way where the warnings were posted, rating the coming tremor activity as minor, the kind the dome absorbed several times a year without comment, without incident, without anyone below the rank of technician even noticing it had happened at all. Halvorin has weathered tremors far worse than this without concern, Ovek said, and heard, even as he said it, how much it sounded like something he was repeating rather than something he had personally verified. I believe you, Ren said easily. I'm not saying panic, and I'm not saying your data's wrong. I'm saying I'd feel better if this got written down somewhere that isn't just my personal tablet, in case it turns out to matter later, and nobody remembers exactly what it looked like today. Mind if I show your council the photos? Get a second opinion logged. Ovek minded, more than he expected to. The Depth Council did not appreciate outsiders raising structural concerns without a master engineer's formal sign-off, and Halvorin was in no state to give one, a fact Ovek was not yet ready to say out loud to a stranger who had been on the colony for less than a day. He said as much, more sharply than the moment strictly required. Ren only nodded, entirely unoffended, and slid the tablet back into one of his many pockets. Your call, he said. It's your dome. I'm just here to write things down, Ovek. That's genuinely the whole job description. Ovek watched him walk back toward the access ring, unhurried, murmuring quietly to his tablet again about something Ovek couldn't hear from that distance. He told himself the whole exchange was harmless, a stranger's overcaution, nothing more. He almost believed it. Almost. That evening Ovek sat beside Halvorin's bed in the med bay, the old engineer's breathing slow and even under a blanket woven from the sand-kelp fiber, and tried, as he tried most evenings now, to pull one more fragment of the architecture out of him before it was gone for good, the way you might try to catch water in cupped hands before it finished draining away. The Eastern manifold, Ovek said quietly, leaning close. You told me once there's a compensating adjustment you make during storm season that isn't written into any schematic. I never learned it properly. I need you to tell me now, while you still can. Halvorin's eyes opened partway. For a long moment there was nothing behind them but fog, the particular fog that had been settling in more and more over the past weeks, thicker on some days than others. Then, slowly, some thread of the man Ovek had trained under for 11 years surfaced through it, faint but present. Feel it, Halvorin said, his voice a dry rasp that cost him visible effort. You don't write it down. You feel it in the deck plating. Took me 30 years before I could feel it right. I do not have 30 years. No, Halvorin agreed, and something that might once have been sympathy moved briefly across his face before the fog began pulling him back under. You don't. Never did you? Wasn't fair to you, that. Wasn't anybody's fault, either. He drifted off a few moments later, mid-sentence, the way he did most evenings now. Ovek sat with him a while longer anyway, listening to the slow mechanical hum of the med bay's life monitors, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange and precarious it was that an entire colony's survival rested on whether one dying man's hand still remembered something his mouth could no longer put into words for anyone else to inherit. This was the whole foundation of Ithun engineering doctrine, and Ovek had never seriously questioned it until this exact year of his life. A master engineer trained one apprentice across most of a working lifetime, because the knowledge in question was not the kind that could be flattened cleanly onto a page. It lived in judgment, in the accumulated feel of 10,000 small decisions made and revised and made again, and writing it down had always been considered, gently but firmly, a kind of theft from its meaning. Reducing decades of earned understanding into instructions a stranger could follow without ever earning them felt, to generations of Ithun engineers, like handing someone a key to a door they hadn't built and didn't understand. The Depth Council enforced this belief not out of bureaucratic stubbornness, but out of genuine reverence. A master's knowledge was sacred precisely because it could not be copied. That scarcity was what made the colony's trust in it absolute, unquestioned, and, Ovek was only now beginning to admit to himself, dangerously fragile. Ovek had heard the story of the founding storm more times than he could count, first from his own parents and later, in far greater and more painful detail, from Halvrin himself. In the colony's third decade, before the single master doctrine had ever been formalized, a rotating council of 5 engineers had argued for 11 straight hours over how to respond to a surge that was, in hindsight, well within the dome's tolerances. By the time they agreed on a course of action, the outer ring had already flooded on its own, and 4 people had drowned waiting for a decision that should have taken minutes. The colony had buried its dead, disbanded the council within the week, and chosen instead to place its trust in a single voice, trained for decades, unquestioned in the moment it mattered. For 130 years, that choice had been vindicated every single time it was tested. Nobody currently living on Mirren Deep had ever seen it fail. Ovek understood, sitting in the medbay that evening, that he was about to become the first. It had worked for 130 years because every previous handoff had had time. Decades of overlap, careful and unhurried, one master's whole life spent gradually pouring itself into the next. Sitting there in the quiet hum of the medbay, watching Halvrin's chest rise and fall in shallow, careful breaths, Ovek understood with a cold, settling certainty that his was the first generation in the colony's entire history where the handoff would not have that luxury of time. He did not know yet what that meant for Mirren Deep. He only knew that it frightened him more than the tremors ever had. He did not mention any of this to the human. It was not information he was ready to hand to a stranger who had been aboard for less than a week, however carefully that stranger seemed to be listening. 3 days later, a secondary coolant line in the eastern manifold began to weep at a rate the automated systems logged as within acceptable tolerance, and that Ovek's gut told him, with an unease he couldn't fully justify on paper, was not actually fine at all. It was the kind of small, deniable problem Halvrin would have solved in a single unhurried afternoon without anyone else on the colony ever noticing there had been a problem to begin with. Ovek stood in front of it for 40 minutes, and did not know what to do. He had the schematics memoized. He had every sensor reading pulled up simultaneously across 3 separate displays. He did not have 30 years of feeling the answer in the deck plating beneath his boots, and every fix he considered felt less like a decision, and more like a guess wearing a decision's clothing. Ren found him there eventually, tablet under his arm as always, and stood quietly at a respectful distance for a moment before speaking. "You want a second opinion, or you want to be left alone?" Ren asked, which Ovek noted, somewhat grudgingly, was at least the correct question for a stranger to ask. "I want," Ovek said carefully, after a long pause, "a colleague who has 30 years of experience that I do not have. You are not able to offer me that." "No, can't help you there," Ren agreed easily. "Might be able to help with something adjacent, though, if you're open to it. Your call entirely." He crouched down beside the coolant line, turned his tablet sideways, and began scrolling through something Ovek couldn't see the contents of from that angle. This isn't the first time a coolant line's weakened like this near a pressure seam under sustained load. Not on your colony specifically, obviously, this is your colony's first time dealing with this exact system, this exact history. But the underlying physics doesn't much care whose colony it happens to be. Somebody, somewhere, humans mostly since it's mostly humans who bother writing this stuff down, has hit close to this exact failure mode before and recorded what worked and, just as usefully, what didn't. "Where," Ovek said slowly, "is this written down?" "We call it the Commons," Ren said. "It's not official anywhere, exactly, no single guild owns it or vouches for all of it. It's just what happens when a species spends a few hundred years apparently unable to stop telling each other how they almost died and what fixed it in time. Firefighters do it. Divers do it. Structural engineers, field medics, pilots, all of them. Somebody screws up, or nearly screws up, and while it's still fresh they write down exactly what happened before the specifics blur, and it goes into a pile anybody in that trade can search later. It's messy. Genuinely messy, half of it is people arguing with the other half in the comments. But it's got a few hundred years of near misses folded into it by now, and honestly, some of them look a lot like your coolant line. He turned the tablet around. Ovek looked at a dense page of human text, annotated in dozens of different hands and dialects of technical shorthand, describing a coolant weld failure on some human structure Ovek had never heard of, on a world whose name meant nothing to him, ultimately solved by a technique that appeared nowhere in any Ithun manual, because no Ithun engineer had ever had reason to write it down for a stranger they would never meet to use. This was written, Ovek said slowly, turning the phrase over as though testing its edges for danger, by someone you have never met, for a problem they once had, on the chance that some stranger they will never meet might have the same problem someday, on some world they will never see. Basically, yeah. Pretty much exactly that. That is not how knowledge is supposed to move. Among my people, it is earned in one body, held there, passed hand to hand across a whole lifetime, or not passed at all. Ren shrugged, entirely unoffended by the challenge in Ovek's voice. Works, though, whatever you make of the philosophy behind it. Small fix, fully reversible if it turns out to be wrong for your system. Your call, not mine, same as always. Ovek looked at the weeping coolant line, and then at the tablet still held patiently in Ren's outstretched hand, and then, briefly, at nothing at all. At the unsent report still glowing faintly somewhere in his mind though he was nowhere near his terminal to see it. Then, quietly, without informing the Depth Council, without telling another living soul on the colony, he tried it. It worked. Cleanly, immediately, exactly as the annotated stranger's notes had described. He stood there afterward for a long moment with his hands still damp from the line, and said nothing at all, and Ren, to his considerable credit, did not gloat or press the point. He only made a brief note on his tablet, and moved on to check the next section of piping, as if it were the least remarkable thing in the world that a stranger's memory could reach across an ocean of years, and an unbridgeable gap between two entirely different species and still fit, precisely, the exact shape of the problem sitting in front of them. Ovek did not report the fix to anyone. He told himself it was a small thing, hardly worth troubling the council with. Somewhere underneath that reasoning, quiet and unwelcome, he understood it as the first crack in something he had believed without question his entire life. He mentioned it, eventually, to exactly one other person, Dessa Okran, a senior seam fitter Ovek had worked alongside on and off for 6 years, without ever exchanging much beyond routine handoffs, and shared complaints about the cold in the lower ring. Dessa had a reputation for being blunt to the point of rudeness, and correct often enough that nobody minded. She found him in the mess hall 2 nights after the coolant fix, looking, in her words, like a man who had done something he wasn't sure he was allowed to be proud of. You used the human's notes, she said, not a question, sliding into the seat across from him. Word travels. Word travels because your hands were shaking when you logged the reading afterward, and I noticed, because I notice things, Dessa said. Did it hold? It held. She was quiet for a while, turning a cup of something warm between her hands. My grandmother used to say the sea doesn't care how you learned what you know, only whether you're right about it when it matters. I always thought that was about respecting the masters. Maybe it was never about that at all. She didn't say anything else on the subject that night, and Ovek didn't push her, but he noticed, over the following days, that she started walking past the human's workstation a little more often than her duties strictly required. The tremor came 4 nights later, and it was not minor. Ovek woke to the whole dome groaning around him in the dark, a low, resonant sound he had heard only twice before in his life, both times standing beside Halvran while the old engineer moved through the corridors with total, unhurried certainty, calling out corrections before anyone else had even registered the danger. This time Ovek was alone in his quarters, and the alarms were already climbing past minor into a category the automated systems didn't have a clean designation for, because Mirren Deep had never in 130 years needed more than 2 working categories, fine, and Halvran will handle it. He ran the corridors half-dressed, boots unfastened, past technicians spilling out of their own quarters in various states of disarray, past a junior tech named Solver frozen in a doorway staring at a ceiling seam that had never once moved in her 4 years on the colony, and was now visibly weeping along its length. The whole dome felt different underfoot, a faint, wrong vibration running through the deck plating that Ovek's body recognized as danger before his trained mind had finished cataloging why. Somewhere below, a structural groan rolled through the colony like something enormous turning over in its sleep. By the time Ovek reached the central control ring, half-dressed and breathing hard from the run, 3 separate seam alerts were flashing red across the main board, including seam 9, the hairline crack Ren had photographed from 11 careful angles 2 weeks earlier. It was no longer a hairline. It had opened into a jagged fracture the length of Ovek's forearm, and the compensating pressure load had shifted violently onto the eastern manifold, the very same manifold whose failing coolant line he had quietly repaired, alone and unauthorized, using a stranger's forgotten notes. The Depth Council convener, a severe elder named Frask Ulay, arrived within minutes, trailed by 2 senior administrators who held broad authority over the entire colony, but had no engineering training whatsoever, because in 130 years that had simply never been necessary. All 3 of them looked immediately to Ovek, the way the whole colony had always looked to whoever stood in the master engineer's place. Ovek looked back at the boards and felt, for the very first time in his life, the specific and total vertigo of being the only formally trained person in a room where every other person present was waiting for him, quietly and desperately, to be enough. "Get Halvarin," Frask said, her voice tight and clipped. "Halvarin cannot stand," Ovek said. "He has not stood, unassisted, in 9 days. Then get him here regardless. Carry him if you must. This colony has never once made a structural decision of this magnitude without the master engineer's authorization in 130 years, and it will not begin tonight, of all nights." They carried him. It took 4 attendants working carefully, and a full 20 minutes that Ovek watched drain away in real time on the board's steadily climbing countdown to critical seam failure. 20 minutes he spent standing helplessly beside instruments he could read fluently but did not yet fully trust himself to act on alone, while somewhere behind him, near the far wall, Ren stood quietly with his tablet in hand, saying nothing at all, watching, waiting to be asked rather than offering himself. Uninvited into a crisis that belonged, by every custom of the colony, to someone else entirely. Halvarin arrived propped upright on a wheeled medical frame, barely conscious, and the council turned to him with the exact same reverence they always had, as if his mere presence in the room might be enough on its own to hold the dome together the way it always had before. He looked at the boards. His eyes tracked the cascading readouts with the faint, unmistakable ghost of 41 years of trained instinct still moving somewhere behind them. His mouth opened. His mouth moved, shaping the first syllables of something that might once have been an instruction, a correction, an order that would have settled the whole room instantly. No sound came out. He tried again, his whole face tightening with an effort that had nothing to do with engineering knowledge and everything to do with a body that had simply, quietly, run out of road months before anyone was ready for it. Ovek watched the old man's expression crumple, and understood, with a clarity that felt exactly like the floor dropping away beneath him, that the plan the entire colony had built its survival around for 130 unbroken years had just failed, silently, without ceremony, in front of everyone who needed it most. "He cannot authorize the repair," Ovek said, into a control room gone suddenly and completely silent. "He cannot speak. Look at him. He cannot give us an order. Then we wait until he recovers enough to," Frask said, and there was genuine fear threaded now beneath the rigid formality of her voice, because she was not a cruel woman, only a badly frightened one clinging with both hands to the only procedure her entire species had ever trusted with its life. "The Eastern Manifold has perhaps an hour," Ovek said. "Possibly less, at the current rate of degradation. Then you will make the repair under his standing authority, as his apprentice, interpreting his instruction, as best you are able." "I do not have his instruction to interpret, Frask. I have 60% of 11 years of training set against his 41. I do not know what I do not know, and on a dome built like this one, that is precisely the part of the equation that kills every single person aboard. It was the first time Ovek had ever said the sentence out loud, to anyone, and saying it did not feel like defeat so much as finally setting down something he had been carrying, alone and silently, for 311 days. The senior administrators attempted the colony's sanctioned fallback procedure, a conservative, strictly by the book seal and hold maneuver meant to buy time in situations where the real expert was merely delayed, not permanently absent. It bought them 11 minutes. Then Seam 9's fracture jumped another finger's width wider, and the Eastern Manifold's pressure reading crossed into a red band none of them had ever personally seen outside of a training simulation, and somewhere far below their boots the whole structure let out a long, low groan that every person standing in that room felt, distinctly, in the roots of their teeth. One of the administrators, a heavy-set man named Corvain, who had spent 30 years managing supply logistics, and had never in his life expected to be standing in a control room during a structural emergency, turned to Ovek with something close to pleading in his voice. "Tell us what to do. You are the apprentice. Tell us." "I do not know," Ovek said, and the admission cost him more than anything he had ever said in his life. "I am telling you the truth, because a comforting lie will drown us exactly as fast as an honest one, and I would rather die having told you the truth." This was the all-is-lost moment, and everyone present understood it as such without anyone needing to say it aloud. There was no master engineer left standing who could authorize anything at all. There was no procedure written anywhere for a colony whose one working expert had simply run out of time before his replacement was ready. 130 years of careful doctrine had assumed, reasonably enough, that this exact night would never actually arrive. It was Wren who finally broke the silence. "I've got something," he said, stepping forward from the wall for the first time. "It's not sanctioned. It's not one trusted voice handing down one clean order, which I know is going to feel wrong to pretty much everyone in this room. I need you to let it happen anyway, because we are flat out of time for anything that feels comfortable." Frask turned on him with something close to fury, the fear inside her finally finding somewhere to point itself. "You are not authorized to speak in this chamber, human." "No, I'm not," Wren agreed, entirely calm. "But your master engineer can't speak either, right now, and your apprentice just told this whole room the truth instead of pretending he has an answer he doesn't have, which took more nerve than anything else I've watched happen tonight. So with real respect, somebody in this room needs to say something useful in the next 4 minutes, and right now I appear to be the only one with my hand up." What Wren proposed was not, strictly speaking, a fix. It was a way of finding one, fast, using everyone at once instead of one exhausted mind alone. For the past 2 weeks, quietly and without anyone's formal authorization, he had been compiling every Ithun maintenance log Mirren Deep had ever kept, cross-referencing every seam design Halvarin had ever managed to document, however incompletely, against the Commons, the sprawling, argumentative, endlessly revised archive of human field knowledge that lived nowhere official and, in a sense, everywhere at once. He had not built a fix for tonight's specific failure, because tonight's specific failure hadn't existed 2 weeks ago when he started. He had built something else entirely, a live, shared document, open simultaneously to every engineer and technician on the dome, where anyone could post exactly what they were seeing on their own section of the structure in real time, and anyone else, anywhere, could answer. "One mind holding the whole picture worked for 130 years, Wren said, pulling the document up onto the main board for the whole room to see, because that one mind had decades to earn it properly. You don't have decades tonight. What you've got is maybe 40 technicians, who each know their own section of this dome better than anyone else alive, right now, this exact minute. Halvarin was never the only expertise on this colony. He was just the only one anybody was ever allowed to listen to at the same time as everyone else." Frask stared at the board, at the empty document waiting to be filled with whatever the next few minutes would decide, and Ovek watched her expression war visibly between 130 years of unbroken doctrine, and the sound of the structure groaning steadily beneath their feet. "It is not one trusted mind," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "It is 40 voices, arguing, while the dome fails around them. It's 40 voices who've each spent years watching one piece of this," Ren said. "I'm not asking you to trust strangers you've never met. I'm asking you to trust your own people, all of them, at once, instead of just one exhausted man who can't speak tonight." There was no time left for further debate about doctrine, however sacred. Ovek made the decision himself, apprentice authority and all, and opened the channel to every terminal on the colony. What followed was not clean. It was not the calm, singular certainty Ovek had spent 11 years training himself to imitate, and utterly failed to summon alone tonight. It was 40 technicians typing over one another in a single shared document that filled almost instantly with contradictions, corrections, and half-formed theories. A senior seam fitter named Dessa Okran posting a close photograph of Seam 9's new fracture pattern within 90 seconds of the channel opening. 3 others recognizing the same load transfer signature from smaller incidents they'd each quietly handled alone over the years and never once had reason to compare notes about with each other. Ovek himself, staring at the scrolling readouts, finally recognized, from the precise shape of the pressure curve on his screen, the exact compensating adjustment Halvarin had once tried, and failed, 4 years, to put into words for him. It turned out the trick was never really a feeling at all. It was a specific, describable sequence of valve timings that simply nobody had ever before had reason to write down for anyone else to use. He typed it into the shared document with hands that would not quite stop shaking. Dessa confirmed it against her own section within seconds, adding a terse note that she'd seen the same curve shape twice before, and had always assumed it was instrument drift rather than a real signal. A junior technician 3 domes over, someone Ovek had barely exchanged more than a greeting with in years of working the same colony, cross-checked it against a valve failure she had documented 8 months earlier, entirely on her own initiative, and flagged one small adjustment in Ovek's sequence that he had gotten backward under pressure. Solve, the young tech who had frozen in her doorway an hour earlier, posted a photograph from the western access point showing a stress pattern nobody else had eyes on, and within 90 seconds 2 more technicians had confirmed it mattered and folded it into the sequence. Even Corvain, who understood none of the engineering, found a use, relaying updates between the control room and the sealed sections where communications were spotty, keeping 40 people, who had never worked together, as a single unit moving in something that started, against every expectation Ovek had walked into that night with, to resemble coordination. They fixed it together, in real time, no single mind holding the whole picture alone, 40 overlapping partial pictures, led fast enough over one another to finally become something whole. The eastern manifold's pressure reading crept slowly, steadily back out of the red band with 11 minutes left on a clock nobody in the room had dared look at directly for the past several minutes. Seam 9's fracture, sealed at last by 3 technicians working from Ovek's corrected sequence, stopped weeping and held. The dome did not fall. Ovek stood in the control room afterward, his hands shaking now from an aftershock that had nothing left to do with the tremor itself, and looked at the shared document still open on the main board, 40 voices worth of corrections and confirmations finally scrolling to a stop. A complete record of exactly how the colony had survived that night, one that no single person present could ever have written entirely alone. Halvarin recovered enough, 3 days later, to be wheeled carefully into the control room and shown the document in full. He read it slowly, his eyes moving line by line over words written by technicians he himself had trained, some of them, and words written by others he barely knew by name, and one short, careful paragraph in Ovek's own hand describing the exact valve sequence Halvarin had spent 30 years of his life learning to feel in his own hands, and had never once, in all that time, managed to properly say out loud to anyone. "You wrote it down," Halvarin rasped, his voice still weak, but steadier than it had been in weeks. "I had to," Ovek said quietly, sitting beside him. I did not have 30 years to spend learning it your way. None of us did, in the end. Halvrin was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ovek braced himself for the argument he'd half expected for 2 full weeks now. The same doctrine Frask had clung to so fiercely in the control room, the old belief that setting a master's judgment down flat on a page stole something essential and irreplaceable from its meaning. Instead, the old man reached out with one trembling hand and touched the edge of the display, gently, the way a person touches something they have finally, after a long time, been given permission to let go of. I always believed, Halvrin said slowly, each word costing him visible effort, that if I wrote it down, it would stop being mine. That the only way it stayed real, stayed earned, was if it lived inside one person, who had paid for it the hard way, same as I did, alone, across a whole lifetime. He looked at the document, still quietly growing even now, other technicians adding small notes about things they'd noticed in the days since the tremor. I was wrong about the earning part, it seems. Nobody who touched this document skipped the years it took them to know their own piece of this dome. They simply stopped assuming they had to know everyone else's piece too, alone, in the dark, hoping against hope they'd be given the decades I was lucky enough to have and you were not. Frask, standing quietly near the door, said nothing for a long moment, and then, in the careful tone of someone amending 130 years of settled doctrine one cautious sentence at a time, said that the Depth Council would formally review whether the Commons format might be adopted going forward, alongside the traditional apprenticeship rather than replacing it outright. Ovek understood, watching her say it, that this was very likely the largest concession he would ever hear that particular woman make in his lifetime, and did not push her for more than she had already given. Dessa found him outside the medbay afterward, leaning against the corridor wall with the particular exhaustion of someone who has not properly slept in 3 days. Heard the council's reviewing the document, she said. They are good, she said, with the bluntness Ovek had come to expect from her. I've spent 6 years watching this colony act like knowledge only counts if it nearly kills someone to keep it in their head alone. I lost my own teacher the same way you almost lost yours. Cave collapse in the outer quarry, 12 years ago. Everything she knew about that rock face went into the water with her because none of us thought to ask her to write any of it down while she was still here to be asked. I always told myself that was just bad luck. Maybe it wasn't luck at all. Maybe it was just how we've always done things, and we never stopped to ask if there was another way. Ovek did not have an answer for that, and he suspected she hadn't been looking for one. She squeezed his shoulder once, briefly, in the human gesture she'd apparently picked up from watching Ren over the past weeks, and left him alone with his thoughts. He found Ren later that evening, walking the lower access ring alone out of old habit rather than any real necessity, tablet tucked under one arm as always, unhurried as ever, as if the ocean pressing endlessly against the glass beside him had never once frightened him at all. Your colonists have lived along this exact ring for 130 years without ever building something like that document, Ovek said, falling into step beside him. Why does your species build such things so easily, so quickly, without anyone ever formally deciding it should happen? We did not think to do it either, and we live beneath water that would kill every one of us for the smallest mistake. Ren considered the question seriously for a while, unhurried, the way he seemed to consider nearly every question Ovek had put to him since the day he'd arrived. Honestly, I think it's because we are bad at remembering things alone, and somewhere a long time ago we finally admitted that to ourselves. So we got into the habit of writing things down and handing them off to whoever came next, just in case we didn't personally make it back to say it out loud ourselves. It wasn't planned, wasn't some clever policy somebody voted on. It's just what happens, eventually, when you almost lose people enough times in a row. You stop trusting any one memory, yours included, to survive entirely on its own, and you start trusting the whole pile instead. Ovek looked out through the glass at the black water pressing endlessly against Mirandeep, the same water it had pressed against, unchanged, for 130 years, and thought of his own unfinished report, the one still titled Succession Readiness, sitting open on his terminal, addressed to no one in particular because he had never quite believed anyone could read it and truly understand what it had cost him to write. He deleted the word negative from the title that night. He did not delete the report itself. He kept writing it, and for the first time since Halverin's decline had begun, he wrote it knowing that whoever eventually read it would not have to hold the entire weight of Mirandeep alone, the way he almost had, the way Halverin nearly had, the way 130 years of quiet, unspoken tradition had simply always assumed someone, somewhere, always would. The document grew steadily after that. Slowly at first, then faster, technicians adding to it the way people add small stones to a wall none of them expects to finish alone in a single lifetime. Nobody on Mirandeep called it a breakthrough, and nobody made any grand speeches about it. It simply became, the way the best and most lasting things on the colony always had, one more quiet part of how everyone there managed, together, to stay alive. By the time the Depth Council finally understood the full shape of what they had actually gained that night beneath the trench, it had already, quietly and without anyone formally deciding it should, stopped being a human idea at all. It had simply become, in the way that mattered most, theirs.